ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। ओम नमो भगवते वासुदेवाय। नारायणं नमस्कृत्य नरं चैव नरोत्तमं देवीं सरस्वतीं व्यासं ततो जयमुदीरयेत्। नष्टप्रायेषु भद्रेषु नित्यं भागवत सेवया भगवतिरुत्तमश्लोके भक्तिर्भवति नैष्टिकी। ॐ अज्ञानतिमिरान्धस्य ज्ञानाञ्जनशलाकया चक्षुरुन्मिलितं येन तस्मै श्रीगुरवे नमः। नमो विष्णुपादाय कृष्णप्रेष्ठाय भूतले श्रीमते भक्तिवेदान्तस्वामिनिति नामिने। नमस्ते सारस्वती देवे गौरवाणी प्रचारिणे निर्विशेष शून्यवादी पाश्चात्य देशधारिणे। जय श्री कृष्ण चैतन्य प्रभु नित्यानंद श्री अद्वैत गदाधर शिवासादि गौरभक्तवृंद। हरे कृष्ण 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 हरे हरे, हरे राम 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 हरे हरे। ओके 326:16 प्रभावं पौरुषं प्राहुः कालम् एके यतो भयम् अहंकार विमूढ़स्य कर्तुः प्रकृतिमीयुषः। The influence of the Supreme Person of Godhead is felt in the time factor, which causes fear of death due to the false ego, the deluded soul who has contacted material nature. So actually in the 11th canto yesterday I was reading this one very nice piece of information. So this is important to understand why due to the false ego. Actually actually Uddhava asks Krishna, saying the soul is spiritual. So soul cannot experience anything material, right? Because by constitution it is spiritual, and body is dead, dead matter. So what is actually experiencing all the emotions? Uh, who is actually experiencing pain, pleasure, etc.? And then amazing answer Krishna gives, saying that it's actually the false ego. So the false ego has no basis; it's subtle. And the false ego is experiencing all this pain, pleasure, fear, all kinds of those emotions are actually experienced by the false ego. And because the soul is so closely connected with false ego, because he wants to enjoy independent of Krishna, soul is getting affected. Soul is experiencing that pain, pleasure, fear, everything. So it's actually the false ego. And that is the reason why Chaitanya Mahaprabhu said Trinadapi Sunichan. Because this false ego has to go. So false ego has to go. Right? If false ego, if based on the extent of reduction of the false ego, our experience of pains, pleasures, fear, etc., all emotions connected to the material world will just reduce. So it's important missing link. So that false ego is not talked about much. We talk about mind, we talk about other things, but we don't talk much about false ego. And it's this false ego which actually is the root cause of our existence here. The first thing that gets created when the jiva enters the material world is false ego. Right? So it's the most, it's what is actually creating all troubles for us right now. Mm. Okay, anyway, that was just a separate piece of information. Living entity's fear of death is due to his false ego of identifying with the body. Everyone is afraid of death. Actually, there is no death for spirit soul, but due to our absorption in the identification of the body as self, the fear of death develops. So again, false ego means this absorption in the identification of the body. And so there is fear of death because body is going to get destroyed. But this body is temporary. It's also stated in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Vayam Dvitiya Viniveshata Syat. Dvitiya refers to matter, which is beyond spirit. Matter is a secondary manifestation of spirit. For matter is produced from spirit. Matter is produced from spirit because from supreme spirit matter is produced. Material nature comes. And just as material elements described are caused by the supreme lord or supreme spirit, the body is also product of the spirit soul. Therefore, the material body is called Vitiya, or the second. One who is absorbed in the second element or second exhibition of the spirit is afraid of death. Ditya Abhinivesha. So this is the second manifestation, second exhibition of the spirit. First exhibition is the spirit itself. Second exhibition is this mm, connection with matter. This matter is the second exhibition of spirit. Because we are absorbed with this second element, which is this matter, we are afraid of death. So it's so closely connected, with our situation. When one is fully convinced that he's not his body, there's no question of fearing death, since the spirit soul does not die. So when one is fully convinced he's not his body, then there's no question of fearing death. Now, if one is fully convinced that he's not his body, still um, maybe death, people don't fear death, but people um, fear other things. Mm, uh, but yeah, which basically means that they're not fully convinced. They are convinced to some extent that I'm not the body, but they're not fully convinced. If one is fully convinced that he's not the body, then he's in this Brahmabhuta stage. Then he is not na sochati na kankshati. Mm. So this fear is because of this bodily connection, strong bodily connection. Mm. Mm. The spirit soul engages in the spiritual activities of devotional service. He is completely freed from the platform of birth and death. His next portion is complete spiritual freedom from a material body. The fear of death is the action of the Kala, of the time factor, which represents the influence of the Supreme Person of Godhead. So Kalosmi, Krishna says, and Arjuna asks Krishna saying that after seeing Vishwarupa, "Hey, what are you? Who are you?" Krishna says, Kalosmi, and this time factor. And time factor destroys everything. So death is also action of the time factor. In other words, time is destructive. Whatever is created is subject to destruction and dissolution, which is the action of time. So which is why it is said that time doesn't exist in the spiritual world. It is this destructive, dissolutive feature of time that is not existing in the spiritual world. It's not like there is no morning, afternoon, evening, night, etc. Those things are there. Today, tomorrow, all that is there. But there is no destruction. And hence time is not there. Time is a representation of the Lord, and it reminds us all that we must surrender unto the Lord. But unfortunately, we don't look at time that way. Mm. It was yesterday and now it's today, and we have just lost one more day in our life. That's all. Mm. But did it remind us to surrender to Krishna? No, because we are so absorbed. We are absorbed in materialism, material things, things that we are doing, that we don't realize that actually our time is reducing. Because of our time is reducing, we have to surrender fully as early as possible. The Lord speaks to every conditioned soul as time. He says in Bhagavad Gita, if someone surrenders unto him, then there's no longer any problem of birth and death. We should therefore accept the time factor as the Supreme Person of Godhead standing before us. So this is also very nice, when because of time factor, we experience something in our life, some happiness, distress. We have to see the time factor as Supreme Lord. So, so basically, we have to develop this vision of seeing the Supreme Lord everywhere, in every situation. Mm. But it's so difficult because we are so absorbed. We are so materially absorbed. Yesterday, I was just thinking, simply, I'm riding on a bike. I was going to some program. I was riding a bike, and then I was thinking, what I'm whole route, like from my house to that program. Yeah, just maybe once or twice some thought of Krishna came out. Maybe it didn't also. I don't remember clearly. Then after I reached there, I was thinking, saying that okay, 20 minutes ride, no Krishna, right? So which means that okay, we are seeing traffic, we are seeing signal, we are seeing people, we are seeing vehicles, we are seeing all this, but we are not seeing Krishna. So we just lost time because we are absorbed in our own, thoughts and what I need to do, this, that, and all that. So we don't see. I mean, time is just passing by. Time is passing by. Hmm. So you have to really become serious, right? Because time will just go, and then we'll just imagine if we have to take birth again in this miserable material world. It's not a happy thing. So the other point is this false ego. So we have to also work on this false ego. Of course, for everything, sometimes we get the answer. Oh no, no, devotional service will do everything. Yeah, but devotional service will do everything if you are not fueling materialism. But today, the way we are living life, we are fueling materialism. Some that I am this body is still there. We are fueling that thought. If you are continuously fueling that thought, then bhakti is because we are putting water. We are doing practice of bhakti for how many? 2 hours, 3 hours, 21 hours. We are fueling false ego. So how fast will our progress be? Of course, bhakti is super powerful, but the dilution that we are doing during the whole day doesn't will. Hmm, what is the point? The point is that because of this material conscious bodily conception of life, as Prabhupada says, the desire to actually achieve Krishna will not happen. So somebody for whom the desire to achieve Krishna comes in, then that 2 hours, 3 hours will subsequently go to 4 hours, 5 hours, 6 hours, and then 24 hours. Hmm. But for whatever reason, if the desire to achieve Krishna is not strong in our heart, and we are only doing 2 or 3 hours bhakti, then the remaining 21 hours we are fueling material bodily conception of life, then our progress will be very slow. Mm. If we want to progress seriously in bhakti, we have to be completely absorbed in Krishna. Anything that we are doing, be it chanting, reading, hearing, association with devotees, whatever we are doing, we have to be completely absorbed to such an extent that, oh, I'm not going to get this time again. This is time lost. Hmm. We have to be very, very careful. Anyway, the point is this false ego. We have to be careful about this false ego. Don't fuel false ego. So we should be happy if our life situations beat down our false ego. Either in terms of um, very difficult material situations, difficult relations, difficult boss, difficult job, whatever it is, it's just beating down our false ego. And which is very good, because then pride has to go down first. If pride doesn't go down, then we cannot come to understanding that I am soul. Because pride is like sitting on top of false ego. False ego is just this identification with body, but pride means it takes it to another level. And when somebody is proud, proud about what? Not of that they are spirit soul. Proud that I am this body and I'm this person and I'm able to do this that. So that pride, or Krishna says in 16th chapter, right? Dambo, Darpo, Vimanascha, all these demoniac qualities that has to first reduce. Uh, Pride, arrogance, um, conceitedness, self-conceitedness, abhimana, like I'm some. So all these things have to go. If these things don't go, then the um, identification with body will not go. Hmm. So this is also very, very important factor. Okay. प्रकृतेर्गुणसाम्यस्य निर्विशेषस्य मानवी चेष्टा यतः स भगवान् काल इत्युपलक्षितः. My dear mother, O daughter of Swayambhu Manu, the time factor, as I've explained, is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, from whom the creation begins as a result of the agitation of the neutral, unmanifested nature. That's we already spoke about. Pradhana. Pradhana will get agitated, and then there is creation. In the unmanifested state of material nature, Pradhana is being explained. Lord says that when the unmanifested material nature is agitated by the glance of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, it begins to manifest itself in different ways. Before this agitation, it remains in the neutral state, without interaction by the three modes of material nature. This already we discussed yesterday. In other words, material nature cannot produce any variety of manifestations without the contact of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Hmm. So Pradhana has all the ingredients, but it can't produce anything because it is dead. Right? So the super soul, he in this case, has to contact material nature. This is very nicely explained in Bhagavad Gita. Supreme Personality of Godhead is the cause of the products of material nature. Without his contact, material nature cannot produce anything. The Chaitanya Charitamrita also a very suitable example is given in this connection. Although the nipples on a goat's neck appear to be breast nipples, they do not give milk. Similarly, material nature appears to the material scientist to act and react in a wonderful manner. But in reality, it cannot act without the agitator, time, who is a representation of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. When time agitates the neutral state of material nature begins to produce varieties of manifestations. Ultimately, it is said that the Supreme Person of Godhead is the cause of creation. As a woman cannot produce children unless impregnated by a man, material nature cannot produce or manifest anything unless it is impregnated by the Supreme Person of Godhead in the form of the time factor. Okay, pretty clear. Antapurusharupena kalarupena yo bahihi samanvetyesha sattvanam bhagavanatma mayaya. By exhibiting his potencies, the Supreme Person of Godhead adjusts all these different elements, keeping himself within as the super soul and without as time. Everything is being managed by the Supreme Person of Godhead. Yet he stated that within the heart, the Supreme Person of Godhead resides as the super soul. This situation is also explained in the Bhagavad Gita. Super soul rests beside the individual soul and acts as a witness. Hanumanta Upadrushta. It is also confirmed elsewhere in the Vedic literature. Two birds are sitting on the same tree of the body, one is witnessing and the other is eating the fruits of the tree. This Purusha or Paramatma, who resides within the body of the individual soul, is described in Bhagavad Gita as Upadrushta, witness, and Anumanta, sanctioning authority. The conditioned soul engages in the happiness and distress of the particular body given him by the arrangement of the external energy of the Supreme Lord. Hmm. Engages in conditioned soul, engages in happiness and distress of the body. Well, actually, the soul should engage in the happiness of the soul, uh, but it is engaged in the happiness and distress of the body. The supreme living being or the Paramatma is different from the conditioned soul. Is described in Bhagavad Gita as Maheshwara, Supreme Lord. Is Paramatma, not Jivatma. Paramatma means super soul, who is sitting by the side of the conditioned soul just to sanction his activities. The conditioned soul comes to this material world in order to lord it over material nature. Since one cannot do anything without the sanction of the Supreme Lord, he lives with the Jiva soul as witness and sanction giver. He is also Bhokta. He gives maintenance and sustenance to the conditioned soul. Since the living entity is constitutionally part and parcel of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Lord is very affectionate to the living entities. Unfortunately, when the living entity is bewildered or illusioned by the external energy, he becomes forgetful of his eternal relationship with the Lord. But as soon as he becomes aware of his constitutional position, he is liberated. Now, aware means being situated in that position. Hmm. Then he is liberated. The minute independence of the conditioned soul is exhibited by his marginal position. If he likes, he can forget the Supreme Person of Godhead and come into material existence with a false ego to lord it over material nature. But if he likes, he can turn his face to the service of the Lord. The individual living entity is given that independence. And this is what we are misusing. His conditional life is ended and his life becomes successful as soon as he turns his face to the Lord. But our problem is we turn our face to the Lord, then again we turn away. We turn towards the Lord, again we turn away. And the turn away business has to stop. That turning away is also misuse of independence. But by misusing his independence, he enters into material existence. Yet the Lord is so kind that as super soul, he always remains with the conditioned soul. Hmm. The concern of the Lord is neither to enjoy nor to suffer from the material body. We also should actually remain like this. Our concern should not be to either enjoy or suffer this material body. He remains with the jiva simply a sanction giver and witness so that the living entity can receive the results of his activities, good or bad. So without Paramatma, nothing can happen. That is why in the five factors of action, the ultimate and the most powerful is the super soul. Krishna speaks about that in I think, 18th chapter. Outside the body of the conditioned soul, the supreme person of Godhead remains as the time factor. According to the Sankhya system philosophy, there are 25 elements. The four elements are already described, plus the time factor make 25. According to some learned philosophers, the super soul is included to make a total of 26 elements. The Supreme Lord is present as super soul within and outside as time. And by between the super soul and time, everything is being adjusted by the Supreme Person of God. दैवात् क्षुभितधर्मिण्यां स्वस्यां योनौ परः पुमान् आधत्ता वीर्यं सा सूत महत्तत्त्वं हिरण्मयम्. After the Supreme Person of Godhead impregnates material nature with his internal potency, material nature delivers the sum total of the cosmic intelligence, which is known as Hiranmaya. This takes place in material nature when she is agitated by the destinations of the conditioned souls. Sum total of cosmic intelligence is called Hiranmaya. This is basically the Anda. The impregnation of material nature is described in Bhagavad Gita, 14th chapter, verse 3. Material nature's primal factor is Mahatattva, or breeding source of all varieties. This part of material nature, which is called Pradhana as well as Brahman, is impregnated by the Supreme Person of Godhead and delivers varieties of living entities. Material nature in this connection is called Brahman because it is a perverted reflection of spiritual nature. We discussed this yesterday, Saguna Brahman and Nirguna Brahman. So this Pradhana is Saguna Brahman. It is described in the Vishnu Purana that the living entities belong to the supreme spiritual nature. The potency of the Supreme Lord is spiritual, and the living entities, although they are called marginal potency, are also spiritual. The living entities were not spiritual. This description of impregnation by the Supreme Lord would not be applicable. The Supreme Lord does not put his semen into that which is not spiritual, but it is stated here that the Supreme Person puts his semen into material nature. This means that the living entities are spiritual by nature. After impregnation, material nature delivers all kinds of living entities, beginning from the greatest living creature, Brahma, Lord Brahma, down to the insignificant ant, in all varieties of form. So material nature is also spiritual, Jiva is also spiritual, and that is why this whole creation is happening. In Bhagavad Gita, material nature is clearly mentioned as Sarva Yonishu. This means that of all varieties of species, demigods, humans, animals, birds, beasts, whatever is manifested, material nature is the mother and Supreme Lord is the seed-giving father. Generally, it's experienced that the father gives life to the child, but the mother gives its body. Although the seed of life is given by the father, the body develops within the womb of mother. So same thing is happening. Similarly, the spiritual living entities are impregnated into the womb of material nature, but the body, being supplied by material nature, takes on many different species and forms of life. The theory that the symptoms of life are manifest by the interaction of the 24 material elements is not supported here. The living force comes directly from the Supreme Person of Godhead and is completely spiritual. Therefore, no material scientific advancement can produce life. The living force comes from the spiritual world and has nothing to do with the interaction of the material elements. This is all known stuff. Mm. So this Hiranmaya, I think in the next verse it will be explained. Um, विश्वमात्मगतं व्यञ्जन् कूटस्थो जगदङ्कुरः स्वतेजसा पिबत् तीव्रम् आत्मप्रस्वापनं तमः. Thus, after manifesting variegatedness, the effulgent Mahatattva, which contains all the universes within itself, which is the root of all cosmic manifestations, and which is not destroyed at the time of annihilation, swallows the darkness that covered the effulgence at the time of dissolution. So, when dissolution happens, this effulgence is covered by darkness. So, here it's saying this Mahatattva, which is effulgent, now swallows the darkness, which means basically it's time for creation. Darkness is gone. Since the Supreme Person of Godhead is ever existing, all blissful and full of knowledge, his different energies are also existing in the dormant state. Thus, when the Mahatattva was created, it manifested the material ego and swallowed up the darkness which covered the cosmic manifestation at the time of dissolution. This idea can be further explained. A person at night remains inactive, covered by the darkness of night, but when he is awakened in the morning, the covering of night or the forgetfulness of the sleeping state disappears. Similarly, when the Mahatattva appears after the night of dissolution, the effulgence is manifested to exhibit the variegatedness of this material world. So basically, it's time for creation. So the uh, darkness is removed, and subsequently creation happens. यत्तत् सत्त्वगुणं स्वच्छं शान्तं भगवतः पदं यदाहुर्वासुदेवाख्यं चित्तं तन्महदात्मकम्. The mode of goodness, which is clear, sober status of understanding this personality of Godhead, and which is generally called Vasudeva or consciousness, becomes manifest in the Mahatattva. Now, the manifestation of ego um, falls. The ego will no, the modes of material nature are there, and then false ego is produced. So all these things are being discussed. First, there is mode of goodness. A mode of goodness is clear, sober status of understanding personality of Godhead, which means one who is in the mode of goodness can actually understand the Supreme Lord. Mm. And generally called Vasudeva or consciousness becomes manifest in the Mahatattva. This is pure goodness because there is no contamination yet. The Vasudeva manifestation or the status of understanding the Supreme Personality of Godhead is called pure goodness or Shuddha Sattva. In the Shuddha Sattva status, there is no infringement of the other qualities, namely passion and ignorance. In the Vedic literature, there is mention of the Lord's expansion as the four personalities of Godhead, Vasudeva, Sankarshana, Pradyumna, Aniruddha. Here in the reappearance of the Mahatattva, the four expansions of Godhead occur. He who is seated within as super soul expands first as Vasudeva. Hmm. The Vasudeva stage is free from infringement by material desires and is the status in which one can understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead or the objective which is described in the Bhagavad Gita as Adbhuta. This is another feature of the Mahatattva. The Vasudeva expansion is also called Krishna consciousness, for it is free from all tinges of material passion and ignorance. This clear state of understanding helps one to know the Supreme Personality of Godhead. The Vasudeva status is also explained in Bhagavad Gita as Kshetragna, which refers to the knower of the field of the activities as well as the super knower. The living entity who has occupied a particular type of body knows that body. But the super knower, Vasudeva, knows not only a particular type of body but also the field of activities in all the different varieties of bodies. In order to be situated in clear consciousness or Krishna consciousness, one must worship Vasudeva. Vasudeva is Krishna alone. When Krishna or Vishnu is alone without the accompaniment of his internal energy, he is Vasudeva. When he is accompanied by his internal energy, he is called Dwarkadisha. To have clear consciousness or Krishna consciousness, one has to worship Vasudeva. It's also explained in Bhagavad Gita that after many, many births, one surrenders to Vasudeva. Such a great soul is very rare. In order to get released from the false ego, one has to worship Sankarshana. So here, first thing is saying that to have clear consciousness, one has to worship Vasudeva. In order to get released from false ego, one has to worship Sankarshana. Sankarshana is also worshipped through Lord Shiva. The snakes which cover the body of Lord Shiva are representations of Sankarshana. And Lord Shiva is always absorbed in meditation upon Sankarshana. One who is actually a worshipper of Lord Shiva as a devotee of Sankarshana can be released from false material ego. So one should be a worshipper of Lord Shiva as a devotee of Sankarshana, not as Lord Shiva as supreme. Not with that perspective. Considering Lord Shiva as a devotee of Sankarshana, one who worships Lord Shiva, he will get released from false material ego. See, if one wants to get free from material disturbances, and now this is mind. So false ego. So consciousness. So this is very nice. Clear consciousness, Vasudeva. False ego, Sankarshana. Mental disturbances, mind, one has to worship Aniruddha. So if someone has very lot of troubles with the mind, one has to worship Aniruddha. For this purpose, worship of the moon planet is also recommended in the Vedic literature. Similarly, to be fixed in one's intelligence, one has to worship Pradyumna. So mind, intelligence, false ego, consciousness, who is reached through the worship of Brahma. These matters are explained in Vedic literature. I mean, if somebody is very heavily tormented by one of these, right, like false ego or lot of mental disturbances, or intelligence is not very material, is not letting us to come to Krishna, then we can worship Sankarshana, Aniruddha, Pradyumna. Sankarshana for false ego, Aniruddha for mental disturbances, and Pradyumna for intelligence. And for clear consciousness, we can worship Vasudeva. Of course, they are all in Krishna, so we don't have to separately worship also. We can directly pray to Krishna, but we can also do this. There's nothing, no harm. Hmm. Other point is that we have to eventually come to mode of goodness, because this whole creation, the beginning is mode of goodness, then passion, ignorance come. So we have to move away from this passion, ignorance, come back to goodness. And when we come back to goodness, then we have to come to pure goodness. Come back to goodness meaning today majority of our life is affected by our activities is passion and ignorance. So first the majority influence should be goodness. Then the residual influence of passion and ignorance has to be removed, and then we have to come to pure goodness. Mm. So we have to live like a Brahmana. That is the whole point. Mode of goodness means Brahmana. Okay, I think we'll stop here. Lot of okay, we'll stop here. This is all already actually second and third canto topics, being again Kapila Muni is again summarizing. Yeah. Yes. Any questions, comments?
Hare Krishna Prabhu. In
Hare
this
Krishna.
part last, it was explained that when he is accompanied by his internal potency, he is called Dvarkadisha.
Yeah, yeah. No, basically when Krishna is there with his internal potency, so he's in Dwarka, he's with the queens, so he's called Dwarakadish. When he's in Vrindavan, he's called Shamasundara. And when he's in Mathura, he's called Vasudeva. Because in Mathura, he's not there with his internal potency. Mm. So Vasudeva, when he was born, he was Vasudeva. He was alone. Yeah, so that way we can understand.
Hare Krishna.
Yeah.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji,
Hare
Dandavat.
Krishna. Dandavat Mataji.
Prabhuji, like when you say, can you just kindly first repeat like the false ego and this? And Prabhu, when you say false ego is the cause, is it subtle mind or is it like most of the places in lectures we come across the subtle mind? The mind is very subtle. The mind is very subtle, and that is the cause of the downfall or whatever. Like you have to work on your mind. But today, when you say it's false ego, is it interconnected? Or it is different?
So we say there are three. Okay, so first is so there is mind, intelligence, and false ego, right? Sukshma sharir, right? In the subtle body, there is mind, intelligence, and false ego. So the false ego is the first to get created. When the Atma, see, Atma is pure. Now, Atma wants to lord it over material nature. So for the Atma to lord it over material nature, two things are required. One is forgetfulness of his position of as servant. That is one thing required. Second is he needs a vehicle for enjoyment, or he needs some kind of a mechanism to enjoy material world, because he cannot directly enjoy material world because he is spiritual and material world is material. Right? So Atma cannot directly contact material nature to enjoy material nature, because of the nature. Right? Constitutionally, it's spirit and the other is matter. So one intermediate subtle entity comes into existence, which is called false ego. So what this false ego does is actually it gives the two things. It creates forgetfulness of the original position that we are servants of Krishna, and it gives a connection with the body, which is the vehicle for material enjoyment. So this false ego is that connecting point between matter and spirit. So you can think that spirit is on one side, matter is on the other side, false ego is right there in the middle, giving that connection, right? And this, because the false ego is the connection, it is the most difficult to get destroyed. And everything now actually stems from false ego, because now false ego is
The
focused
first
on,
sentence you had said, like the subtle, the soul is spiritual, so
yeah,
it does not feel the pain. The body is
correct,
dead matter. The body is dead matter,
body is
so it
dead,
cannot feel the pain.
pain either, yes,
That neither. So
yeah,
that which feels and that which feels all the emotion
is the false ego,
is not the subtle body. It is the false ego,
is the
and
false ego which is part of the subtle body. False ego is part of the subtle body. No, subtle body is mind, intelligence, false ego. Hare Krishna.
wheel is the problem.
Sorry, Mataji, your voice broke. What are you saying?
So like it's like the car and the driver, and what connects them is the wheel.
Okay, but these are three different types of elements, meaning
Like
spirit.
गाड़ी dead body हो गया. Okay, like just for the analogy of understanding it. ठीक है प्रभु जी, आप
Yeah.
समझ में आ गए.
Yeah. Right. So that false ego is actually, the false ego then results in intelligence being influenced by false ego. Then mind become influenced by false ego. Actually, see, the mind is actually working for false ego. Right. So that is the reason, in terms of how do we experience the presence of false ego? It's predominantly through mind and intelligence. Right. Because they are, the Prabhupada says, actually the next door neighbor is soul, and on the other side it is intelligence and mind. Both intelligence and mind are influenced by false ego. So they are working to give happiness to the soul through the body and bodily connections. So which is why the false ego is the knot. The false ego is the critical entity, right, which is making this connection. And so we should remember that when I'm feeling pain, we should just remember it's my false ego which is feeling pain. False ego is experiencing pain. I, as Atma, am not experiencing pain. Body is dead, so it's not experiencing any pain. It's just the false ego which is experiencing pain. And the false ego is also this connection, thinking that I am this body. And because I am thinking that I am the body, that false ego, the pain that is experienced by the false ego is also experienced by the soul because of that connection. So which is the reason this false ego has to get converted to real ego, which is me, which is the real identity of us, that I'm not this body, I'm nothing to do with this body, I'm spirit soul. And the process of bhakti automatically does it, just that it's technical. We have to just remember that when I'm feeling pain, oh, it's just my false ego. It's a subtle element in my body, in this subtle body, and it's experiencing the pain. I am not experiencing. So chill maro.
चिल तो मारा नहीं जाता.
चिल मारना है अभी, ये सब सुन के चिल मारना है. हाँ. Okay. Anything else, anybody? Okay, very technical stuff. I'm trying to explain as much as I understand.
No, very true.
Okay. Close here.
Okay,
Srimad
thank you,
Bhagavatam
Prabhu.
ki jai, Jagadguru Srila Prabhupada ki jai, Vanchakalpatarubhyashta kripa sindhubhyo cha, Pitana Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Anantakoti Vaishnavandi ki jai, Samveta Gaura Bhaktivinoda ki jai. Hare Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji. Dandavad
Hare
pranam to
Krishna,
everybody. Hare
Dandavad,
Krishna.
Hare Krishna, Dandavad.
No,
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.